Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 6th SSP webinar of 2020. You're joining us for a discussion titled Moving Beyond Good Intentions, Creating a Diverse and Inclusive Community Through Commitment and Action. I'm Jeff Lang with the American Chemical Society, the chair of the SSP Webinars Working Group, and we're pleased you could join us today. In a moment, we'll get started and you'll hear from our panelists. You'll be seeing the SSP splash screen as we start this session. Your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the questions feature on the right side of your screen to send in your questions or to let us know if you're having any technical difficulties. Moderators will review your questions and present them and discuss them later on in the sessions. Please specify to which of our panelists you're presenting a question to or to either. And please also send the questions in as you go. They'll be addressed after the presentations. At the conclusion of today's session, you'll also receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so that we can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You'll also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar. Our panelists today are Vernon Morris and Lisa White. Vernon is director of the School of Mathematical and Natural Sciences at Arizona State University. He was founding director of the Atmospheric Sciences program and professor of chemistry and atmospheric sciences at Howard University. He was founding director of the NOAA Cooperative Science Center for Atmospheric Sciences, and he's mentored over 150 students. Lisa White is director of education at the Museum of Paleontology at the University of California, Berkeley. She has extensive experience with science education programs for underrepresented students, and she's active in efforts to increase diversity in the geosciences. A micropaleontologist by training and fellow at the California Academy of Sciences and the Geological Society of America. She works to create a culture that embraces diversity and respect in the advancement of Earth and space sciences and helps AGU become a model organization for inclusive practices. Now I'll turn the webinar over to Vernon, who will start the presentations.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. I want to begin by thanking Randy, Mary Beth, and Jeff for the invitation, the coordination, hosting of me and Lisa on this panel. And I also want to acknowledge that the value of discussions like these that we're having, not just here, but across the nation in a variety of venues, that unfortunately required some of the atrocities in the current political moment to spur, but they have value far beyond this. And I think acknowledging where we are, acknowledging that we can't support or really have to actively combat the censorship of meaningful dialogue about structural racism, about white supremacy in our society, but also in our federal and academic sectors. These communities, I think in particular, should be exemplars of diversity and excellence and inclusion. But unfortunately, they remain demonstrably lacking in the representation of Black scientists, especially in the science mission agencies and the science departments. And so that's something that I think the Society of Scholarly Publishing and my colleagues here are very committed to changing in a positive way. And I also need to do a step back and acknowledge speaking to you from Arizona State University. And Arizona State University has 4 campuses. They're located in the Salt River Valley of Arizona, but they're located on the ancestral territories of indigenous peoples, including the Yakima O'odham, are now called, or sometimes called, the Pima, the Peeposh, who have an appropriated name of Maricopa. But these native communities, it's their care, their keeping of the lands, their sort of solemn oath to the environment that allows us to be here today. So I want to acknowledge that before we start. I also want to acknowledge that language matters. It matters a lot how we talk about the current situation, about the problems that we face or challenges that we face. And so in the vein of keeping our language accurate, I will not use terms like underrepresented groups or minorities. I will use terms the terms racially marginalized or racially minoritized or racially excluded. And in doing so, I'm trying intentionally to not essentialize the problems of underrepresentation onto a group of people. African Americans, indigenous, people of color do not choose to be underrepresented. They become lower than their demographic representation because of structures outside of their agency. And so we want to use language that appropriately places the burdens, the agency in the right place. And I think deficit language that says that instead of looking at the structures that lead to the current situation, but looking at the people who have been victimized by the situation, I think is something that we want to avoid. So by using these terms, we avoid the fix the person solutions and focus on the fix the system solutions. And I think that's well aligned with the title of the talk today, Moving Beyond Good Intentions, Creating a Diverse and Inclusive Community Through Commitment and Action. And so finally, before I get to beyond the first slide, there's a picture here that I want to discuss just a little bit. So I want everyone to take some time and look at the picture and move beyond your first impressions to just look at place and contrast and expressions of folks in this picture. The current historical moment's been called a race awakening in more than one occasion. And I think it's more accurate to say that it's a privilege awakening. America has always been very race conscious. We're very race aware. We live in a very racialized environment. So I don't think we're awakening to race, but we might be awakening to how the privileges of race or the lack of privileges associated with racialized groups affects their health, affects their safety, affects their access to education, affects their access to wealth. And so these things, I think, as white Americans and non-Black Americans become more aware of how privilege plays out in the lives of our other community members, I think the public outrage has appropriately grown. And that's something that makes this a unique time in the history of America. So returning to the picture, it's a black and white photo, and several photos like this throughout the talk from the Bettman Archive and Getty Archives, the Library of Congress. This picture, if we were to talk about diversity and inclusion, is both diverse and inclusive. However, it's not socially just. And so when we focus solely on diversity and inclusion, we're missing a very significant part of what we should be actively and very intentionally pursuing, and that's the social justice aspect of diversity and inclusion, the social justice aspect of all of the endeavors, including science. And so you also see, I think, on the faces of a number of people, how complacency and silent complicity supports imbalance, supports inequity, supports a white supremacist structure, even if you're not actively, or because you're not actively supporting it. So by the silence, by the accepting of the system, you actually exacerbate inequity. And that's why I think what we're saying is good intentions are fine, they're necessary, but action is absolutely necessary as well. Next slide, please. And so today's talk, the outline of today's presentation, rather, is on your right-hand side. We're going to start off actually going to a poll, looking at some of the responses from the polls. I'll overview a little bit on racism in the scientific community and in specifically in geosciences. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague Lisa to talk a little bit more about some of the action plans that have come up, some of the responses from some of the professional societies and recommendations moving forward. And again, I'd like to, a quote Albert Memmi. This is from The Colonier and the Colonized, really a classic book written in the 50s when a lot of the colonial nations were sort of throwing the yoke of colonial government and domination off. Said we're all tempted by racism, and we risk behaving in a racist manner each time we believe ourselves threatened in our privilege, in our well-being, or in our security. And I think that's something to safeguard as we walk courageously into race conversation, is that it's not about the individual. It's not about the individual goodness. It's not a threat to well-being, actually. It's, racism is a threat to all of our well-being. We have to move beyond that. So next slide, please. We're going to move on to some of the responses that we got or received so far from the poll questions. And I'm going to ask, after we talk through this, that if things come to mind as you're listening to this presentation or any parts of the presentation, please use your Q&A box to put in your responses. If you want to respond to some of the questions here, please put those in. And then certainly, as we move to the next section, we're going to ask for attendee participation. So we sent out a couple of questions in advance of this panel. And the first question, one of the questions was, in light of the recent executive orders and memos regarding diversity initiatives and structural racism, how has your organization responded? And there's a number of ways that organizations have responded. Here's just a few examples. Issued statements on the websites, which a number of professional societies have done, a number of organizations have done in private sector as well. Another person responded, it's been especially challenging to proactively recruit members of the community to engage with association leadership opportunities, but we're doing what we can. Real-time Q&A, multiple choice questions are going to come up. Another question that we asked was, what major diversity, equity, and inclusion recommendations resonate the strongest with your organization, and what challenges remain? And a key response to that was figuring out what we need to be measuring, how to measure it, in order to determine where we are now and whether we're making any progress. So baselining, always when organizations are faced with what they think are transformational change, is to say, how do you know that you're progressing far enough, fast enough, and in the right direction, and you need to find a baseline? These are legitimate questions. But sometimes I would caution, the answers are in front of you, and you can begin to move forward even as you design a DEI plan or take on actionable DEI recommendations. So what I'd like to do right now is have everybody participate in a poll. And so, Mary Beth, if you can bring the poll up. And as you respond to this, you can enter your responses into the Q&A box that you have. But please respond to this, and what we're going to do is sort of in real time is capture what the attendees have been engaged in. So the main question, how has your organization responded to recent discussions regarding diversity and structural racism? And these recent discussions could be the executive orders and the memos that have come out in the federal government. They could be the recent discussions that are happening on the general landscape about race, race equity, privilege, discrimination. But in general, how has your organization responded? Have they made a public statement? Have they developed DEI plans or revisited their DEI plans? Have they increased support for marginalized groups? And I see a question of marginalized groups or marginalized people. In particular, we're talking about, in this case, individuals who've been marginalized or minoritized because of their perceived race or race identity. And so in particular, that is Black, Indigenous, Latinx, certain of the Asian Pacific Islander groups that are underrepresented in the science fields, Middle Eastern and North African peoples. And so those groups tend to be in far lower demographic proportion in the sciences than their population in the larger community. And so we call that marginalized. Has the organization conducted analysis of hiring and promotion practices? Have they conducted analysis of publication or peer review practice or something else? And so if it's been something else other than these things, please try to indicate that. And certainly if it's been one of these things, indicate one or more that your organization has been engaged in. And I'll leave it open for another minute. I have 8:16, so I'll leave it open until 8:17. And I think it's important that we focus on not just which actions, but the types of actions that we can undergo and how do they move us forward towards a more equitable science community. And so this was part of the impetus here. Okay. You know, one of the questions that came up, I think that we fielded, I'll just talk through one, was the value proposition of diversity and inclusion. A lot of times we're called upon to justify why being more inclusive, being more diverse in the scientific community benefits science. Personally, I have mixed feelings about that. And the reason why is that, one, there should be a moral imperative to not treat people unequally. As scientists, we should be well aware that race and racism is not a rational or a scientifically based agenda or idea. There actually is no such thing scientifically as race. There's no genetic basis for race. And so what that means is if we're going to be fact-based and follow objective thought and arguments, then we would be including everybody. And it's not about we'll only do this if we're going to get better. Now, I think there are arguments and demonstrations of why more diverse perspectives can be more innovative, can be more creative, can lead to more holistic solutions. But the imperative actually should be a moral imperative to not do things that are anti-scientific within the scientific community or or amoral in a moral society. Let's close the poll. I think it's talked over a little bit, and I think we can show some of the results relatively quickly as well. Thanks, Mary Beth. And so the leading things, interestingly enough, one is actually something that's fairly straightforward. I think making a public statement, 86% of your organizations have done that. Developing DEI plans, which is actually hard work. It includes some of the baselining that was on the previous slide. I'm encouraged that 82% of the organizations are actually undertaking that, because that's something that can, if well resourced, actually is the way to transformative change. So it's good to see that. About 50% are increasing support for marginalized groups in the organization, which is good. Conducting analysis of hiring promotion practices, a little bit less, and then only about a third on analysis of publication and peer reviewed practice. So thank you for that. I'm going to step through in the interest of time, but let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Beth. Mary Beth. Next slide. Next slide. So thanks. So the next, as we move forward, really these two quotes I selected because they remind me of the types of responses that are quite common when we talk about racism in the scientific community. And again, one is from Werner Heisenberg, is a pioneer of quantum mechanics, atomic physics, says we have to remember that what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. And what he the relationship between what we're talking about in this particular panel and what he's saying, I think, is that we pose solutions or develop solutions based on how we pose the question or visualize the problem. We visualize a problem through the lens of our perspectives or biases. And if we are not challenging or examining our biases, we're going to assume that the solution that we have come up with is the solution, is the primal thing. But it's biased as well because of what we see. And so diversity and inclusion allows us to challenge our biases, whether they're implicit or explicit, and actually get to the right questions that help us develop the right types of solutions to actually be transformative. One of the reasons why a number of programs have not led to significant changes in diversity, inclusion, and equity is because they asked the wrong questions. They have not observed the problem outside of their ability to challenge how they're questioning the problem. And so you bring the wrong question, you might get the right answer to that question, not the solution to the actual challenge. And so that's something that we have to challenge all the time. The second quote, greatest resistance to justice is not the challenge against hatred, it's resistance to the overturning of the false realities of the meritocracy, self-identity, and the assumptions of self-worth and goodness. I talked a little bit about this earlier on. It's not a challenge to your own personal goodness. And that has to, if we can remove the threat to self-identity, I think we can make a lot of progress. And so that's something that always, as well, keep in mind. Is there racism in the scientific community? There's actually multitudes of examples that range from the Tuskegee experiment to Henrietta Lacks's HeLa cells. They're still not possessed by her, craniology, phonology, racial classification of humans, rationalization of nuclear testing on sovereign lands of Native Americans or of Pacific Islanders. These are manifestations of racism in STEM, and there are many more. So we don't want to not talk about it because it will make us look bad or feel bad about ourselves. We have to be honest enough to want to make progress. Next slide, please. And geosciences in particular. This slide shows some statistics and question on marginalized folks. BIPOC plus is Black, Indigenous, people of color. That includes the Latinx, the MENA, Asian Pacific Islanders like Filipinos and Fijians, etc. Represent over 31% of the population, less than 15% of the STEM labor force, less than 6% of geoscience PhDs, less than 3% of tenured professors in atmospheric sciences programs, less than 10% of senior executive service in the science mission agencies. And if we think about an equitable society, ostensibly, the representation of any group in any profession would mirror more or less their presence in the society. So if you have 31% of the folks who might be classified or identify as BIPOC or BIPOC plus, you've got in some cases an order of magnitude less representation in certain fields, and geosciences is actually one of the worst. Why is this? That's a question that we should wrestle with historically, but what can we do to change it is a linked but more important question. Joe Fagan has written a number of books on what the legacy of slavery and racial oppression has been, and one of the things he reminds us of is, as a country, we've only outlawed extreme racial oppression outside of mass incarceration or surveillance systems since 1969, less than 100 years ago. It's within the lifetime of a lot of people. And I think this is something that we should inform how we go about developing solutions. Who gets to be a scientist? Who gets to do science at the highest levels? Who gets to produce science and get credit for producing science? Who gets to define what science is the most important? We live in a world that's predominantly BIPOC plus, and a nation that will be approaching 50% BIPOC plus very rapidly. But over 90% of many positions are still non-BIPOC plus. We need to address that. I'll turn it over to Lisa for the next couple slides.
Thank you, Vernon, and hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be able to present this webinar to you today, and we appreciate SSP for inviting us. And at the Museum of Paleontology, where I'm Director of Education at the University of California at Berkeley, we sit on ancestral lands of the Ohlone people. And Berkeley, the campus, certainly in past decades, has a real spirit of activism. The free speech movement was born there, and my prior institution, so before coming to Berkeley 8 years ago, I was professor of geosciences at San Francisco State University. And at that university, the very first College of Ethnic Studies was demanded by students who protested, Black students primarily, who grew frustrated with the lack of representation in big parts of the curriculum. And so I've often been surrounded, someone from San Francisco and the Bay Area, with that spirit of activism and the need to lead change. And this year seemed so different from all my years of representing the need, giving voice to why we should be more inclusive in the geosciences. This year, much of that motivation stepped up, even higher. And so joining forces with colleagues like Vernon and others in our network, many Black geoscientists, Black earth scientists, and atmospheric scientists pretty much said enough. As you all responded in the polls with the events that happened this spring and summer, the George Floyd murder in particular, we saw the flurry of public statements. That's the easiest thing, right, that a university or professional society can do. But we wanted, as a community of activists in the earth sciences, wanted to call on our Black colleagues and our allies to do more than issue statements. It's really time to listen more carefully, act to dismantle structures that perpetuate this constant system of racism. And we were especially motivated in doing this work because we know that developing plans, and we're inspired that many of you stated in the polls that you are part of organizations or institutions that are getting to that next step. But we understand and recognize that assistance is often needed, recommendations, strategies from folks that are experienced is helpful when you're trying to plan these strategies. And so with movements that we've been part of, including the call to action, calls for robust anti-racism plans, we outline a number of recommendation strategies, ways that one and different kinds of organizations can move forward. And so we credit the image that you see there, the initial image, it's a sort of a trackway in rocks, was a movement initiated by Hindrada Ali. And so it received just a tremendous response and signatures. And so people really got behind the plan, which is great. And then Vernon and I, as a companion effort, really wanted to invite, again, more of our colleagues to not only respond to the call and the poll, but let's plan together this emphasis on the action plans. And so as part of this effort, we are excited to just continue leading opportunities, as in what we're doing now, to listen, to react, to act, and together lead, so that we can make significantly more progress in DEI in our field. So if we go to the next slide, I'll walk you through some of the tenets of our No Time for Silence effort. And as we've been explaining and highlighting in our short time together here, it's really not enough to just say that you believe in true equality and equity, inclusion, and participation. We've been hearing that for years. We recognize that you can't dismantle structures in a day, but we certainly as professionals have seen enough, learned enough from past studies, have led other efforts to know that a different kind of meaningful action is needed now. And sometimes it demands different kinds of collaborators, being constantly mindful of the various stakeholders that should certainly, and we're proud as African Americans to lead this effort, but we want to be inclusive of the entire BIPOC community, and we recognize the role that our allies play as well in being able to join forces with us to listen and dismantle structures that continue to perpetuate injustice and white supremacy. And so you can go to the No Time for Silence website and see there are a number of recommendations that we make for institutions, for professional societies, for federal agencies. And on the next slide, I'll highlight some of the recommendations that we put forward as we called on professional scientific societies. And as we've been threading through our talks this morning, we know that some of your organizations seem to already be on that next step beyond the solidarity statement. But it's so important that a robust and meaningful plan that's strategic in nature be part of this effort to dismantle. And in some cases, we found, as we've been talking with groups this spring and summer, and working with our own, working within the professional societies that we belong to, that some had diversity plans already. Perhaps there was a strategic plan outline that was just that in nature. Maybe an outline was done as part of a retreat, but had not been examined for a while. And so if this is the opportunity to brush that off and see where the society stands, then that can be an initial first step. But it's not, those plans don't hold water until you can fully implement some of the recommendations along with resources. So that's so key to a lot of our ability to be able to enact change, is it costs time, money, effort. So that, of course, is often used as an excuse for why you can't do something. But if there is to be, true initiative and action and application of this, then really considering how resources are allocated, are important. And the third bullet there, so we were, of course, pleased that we could do a poll and know from you, to what extent your organizations have tracked any kind of progress, have used assessment and evaluation methods, any metrics to hold the society accountable. And we're starting to see this a bit, at least the recognition that this is needed, but it is often missing. A society or a department will do one program during Black History Month or something, or we'll plan an event to showcase the diversity, and then that's it for the year. And there's not really any, meaningful measure of what even the initial plan was in offering that, and if that's any kind of step to, true inclusiveness in the society. So, we want to be able to keep these kinds of recommendations active as strategies to really try to make some additional progress. And the last bullet there, so this has long been, a weak area of many of the scientific professional societies. So it seems they often spend more time trying to get more diversity in the membership, yet the staff that support many of the efforts, the leadership within the professional societies lacks that very diversity that the society claims to be committed to. So we want to be as mindful in our recommendations when we make that suggestion that, again, this is a holistic problem. You can't work on, one part of the organization or an initial plan within the strategic goals without realizing how connected these all are. I mean, who wants to be part of a professional society that has so little leadership of color that it defeats a lot of the purpose? And so, we hope as societies consider, who's making up their professional ranks, that this is included as well. So we'll go ahead to the next slide, and I'll highlight some things that the American Geophysical Union is doing. So Vernon and I are both members of the Advisory Committee for Diversity and Inclusion, and I have the pleasure of chairing the committee. And prior to the committee being formed as a standing committee, so we're about a year and a half into the committee, there was a task force that AGU put into place about 5 years ago to look at this persistent lack of diversity in the society. And Vernon and I have both been longtime members of AGU, joined as students. And honestly, for years, I just had no expectation for diversity. I'm all about the science, and I really wasn't looking to AGU for a lot of diversity guidance. But when you're 30 years into your membership of a professional society, especially the times we live in, it really got to the point where I was glad to be able, to be a part of this new committee and really give voice to this. So we've seen iterations of diversity recommendations. We've seen leadership at AGU try to tackle this problem. We're pleased that over time, AGU has put a lot of good efforts in place. It's a work in progress, but this year, in response to the events after the solidarity statements, in communication with our committee, the leadership at AGU and the current president, Robin Bell, articulated 8 deliberate steps that we're doing. Again, there have been some things in place for some time. There's been a lot of frustration on the part of the membership, the BIPOC membership of AGU, but we're at least getting to a point where we can move beyond the strategic plan, which there's both a strategic plan for AGU and then one that's diversity and inclusive focused. So here are some things in the spirit of those plans that AGU is prioritizing. And we appreciate that expanding funding for AGU's D&I efforts is first on that list, and for many reasons that we all have experienced, and what continues to feed frustration sometimes is you can't just keep talking about the efforts and things you're going to or would like to do and not give it a budget. So perhaps as this next step, expansion of funding will be key in this effort. And so the second point there, so AGU's governance and committees, so many of them within the society. And so the committees have had to look, deep and consider things that they could be doing to diversify that level of AGU's commitment. So we're seeing that as well. The third point there, I think, is so universal in many professional societies. who we honor, who we recognize. And it's often the most excuse-laden part of a professional society when you try to make recommendations, because the leadership often defaults to, well, the membership, isn't diverse. How are we going to honor a broader scope of scientists if there aren't even that many to begin with? But that's a failed excuse, and there's things that just persist in the way that we recognize scientists' progress, what's meritorious. So this has opened up an area of discussion that is long overdue, is what does the society value and honor, and who is making those kinds of judgments. So it's good to just have a fresh approach with this, because we don't want it to continue to be, that the weak link, that excuse, that area where there's this negative feedback loop and this perpetual, there aren't enough of you to honor. So we're getting there. And the diversity of meetings in number 4 there. So we're, many of us have long joked that there was that one diversity session on the last day of AGU in the way back corner of Moscone Center, where, we would traditionally meet for the fall meeting. And we were supposed to be happy with that. We're supposed to have it fully integrated, diversity and inclusive topics throughout the scientific program. So we're definitely getting there. And with the virtual space now that we all operate in, there's so much opportunity to bring voice and example, to profile leading scientists of color who are doing amazing things in their science, but also make time for broader impact. So as part of our role as members of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at AGU, we've been out in front and recommending different programming, but it shouldn't have to be just our committee, but we want to make sure that's part of it. So I'm looking at the time, and I'll just run through the other points there. And so publications is another area that many societies have traditionally excused for not being more diverse. And I know your society, SSP, knows all the challenges and having more representative authors. So we've got to all work together on that. And then the final points there, and just advocating for policies that help eliminate injustice. As Vernon so nicely covered in his opening, we can't try to make these recommendations and move forward without really getting to the core and the heart of why our nation continues to, have these barriers in place. So we can't, separate those. So many times our conversations need to include social scientists and folks that have expertise in racial injustice and dismantling systemic racism, and the need to really recognize ways that you can foster a culture change. And I believe there's one more slide, and we want to make sure that we have time for questions. And so what are our takeaways? What kinds of urgent actions do we hope our presentation motivates you to do, within the spaces where you work? And it's important that we have to continue to acknowledge that the racism remains in our scientific community. It doesn't mean that we have to continue to be burdened by it, but you must recognize the challenges that we continue to have to work in, and what sorts of special actions it requires now that many of our colleagues are more awake. And it's not good for any of us, clearly, because there's such a distraction from why we are motivated to do our work. I mean, we love our fields and are continually determined to do good science. So it affects us all if we're constantly distracted by the burdens of racism. And so we can't, do all this on our own. I mean, clearly, all our Vernon and mine, our combined years of working on including more individuals of color in our work has resulted in some progress, but we shouldn't have to be doing all of this. We can't expect that it's going to get completely better on its own, or if you're asking the geoscientists of color to always, initiate and act. So these more intentional efforts that we hope are a response to all of the things happening this year, and the more, I think, determined and focused effort to inform each other, to form different kinds of collaborations and connections in the spirit of this urgent action is what we hope results from our ongoing conversations with people. And finally, we just want again to thank you for taking the time to listen to us, and we hope the conversation and our presentation has spurred some ideas and an additional sense of motivation on the part of all of you. And we want to, in our last 15 minutes, ask if you have any questions, examples that you want to share that weren't listed in the poll that we had earlier. And we look forward to hearing from you. Okay, so I want to remind you to use the Q&A box. And I see there are some questions. There's a question from Jeff. So I'll read it. What are the most impactful changes that publishers can make to challenge racism and encourage diversity in science? Well, I'll give one example, and then I'll ask Vernon if he has one as well. So another hat I wear at AGU is I'm one of the science editors for EOS, our weekly journal, and I mostly get the diversity, equity, and inclusion themed articles. And this, so throughout the last couple of years, actually, there has been a concerted effort to include more diversity themed articles. Sometimes they're blogs, sometimes they're full scientific articles that tend to be on the shorter side in EOS. And this year, and actually last year as well, but this year, there's going to be a double issue released in December, so in time for our fall meeting, that is all about folks working to encourage diversity, making real progress in this. And so being able to highlight, I think, what people are doing, and it's not all, it's not presented in a way that claims to have fixed every problem, but it shows the ways in which, embedded in earth and space sciences, folks are doing things. So I think that's one way. I mean, I'm a fan of theme issues. I do think they should be sprinkled throughout the year, but it's nice when you bring attention to all the possibilities within published. So, Vernon, do you have any responses to that?
Yeah, I think this is something that actually came up on the AGU D&I committee recently in our email exchanges, which I will say, I think developing advisory committees to assist your organization or the publication with trying to figure out solutions to the challenges, I think is a really effective way. Bringing in more voices, more experience, more perspectives to look at the problem and say, okay, here are some creative ways that you can address this and move forward aggressively is something I'd encourage everyone to take advantage of. There's a lot of expertise in the community. There really is. There's a lot of expertise on these issues in the community. And putting together a very well-balanced advisory committee is one of the major things that I would advise. I think another thing is diversifying the editorial boards. I think it's really critical that the editorial boards are not sort of monolithic, homogenous types of boards coming from the same set of institutions, the same country, the same set of experiences. And as you, I think, make your editorial boards more inclusive, what you'll find is that the selection of articles that end up coming into the journal and are accepted for publication and are reviewed fairly will change. And so again, this is it's sort of that issue that I think Lisa talked about, is if the focus is on diversifying at the lowest level, you're going to have the slowest rate of change. If you try to diversify throughout the hierarchy, you're going to get a much more meaningful change in a shorter period that could be sustainable if you stick with that. So I think those two things would be my response.
Great. And I see some other questions posted as well. And I want to acknowledge my colleague, Val Sloan, who has mentioned in some comments that it goes without saying some of the organizations in the geosciences, just by way of where they are, what cities they're in, struggle so much with diversity. And so it can make it, ever more challenging. And Peter Lynch, I see you have a question here. And so I'll read it. How can we as publishers help encourage increasing more BIPOC in the pipeline working in the field, whether it's as scientists or as publishing staff? And so Vernon, do you want to comment on that? And it's somewhat related to the earlier question.
Sure. I think one thing I'll maybe make one point to Valerie's question. Hello, Valerie, and then you said to Jeff Lynch, Peter Lynch. I think one of the things that I think that I lived in Japan for 4 years, for example, and ostensibly Japan would be a very unwelcoming place to a Black person. I found it highly welcoming and encouraging, and I didn't feel isolated there. I felt more isolated in Washington State when I moved there than I did in Japan, a country that I did not speak the language. I did not look like anybody else there. I did not know history, but people made me feel welcome. I think one of the ways to maybe shift the way we think about it is not to say, okay, I live in this place and there are very few Blacks, therefore that Black person will feel unwelcome. How welcoming is the place? And can you create spaces that are welcoming there? And I think you'll find that people will be more encouraged to come. There was a picture earlier in the slide deck that had a bar, and there was a sign that said, no Indians allowed. The sign makes it unwelcome, but even if you took the sign down, would it make it more welcome? You've got to change the reception of the place sometimes. Sometimes the culture of the place needs to change as well. That's a difficult proposition in some respects, but you can build networks. You can build spaces such that when the person comes in, they understand the larger context, but there are welcoming spaces for them to enter into. I think that goes a really long ways. I think in terms of Peter's question was on the pipeline into the field. My chat box is a little bit small, but whether scientists are publishing, the question was, how do you encourage, how can we as publishers Yeah, I think one thing is the responses I had earlier, certainly changing the editorial board. I had a really positive engagement with Wikipedia. And Wikipedia's contributions are not very diverse. The pool of folks who contribute to Wikipedia tend to be sort of monolithic as well. And so when I was at Howard University, Wikipedia invited them to come out, participate in classes with undergraduate students, with graduate students, and sort of walk through the process and encourage students in that space to say, look, we value your contributions. We'll help you create, and they help professors as well, create segments of certain classes, some of the chemistry classes, some of the sociology classes, some of different departments, help develop assignments that engage students in creating Wikipedia entries, help them publish in that forum. I think that vehicles like that, engagements like that with publishers who are willing to, okay, let's reach out in a way that values the contributions of the folks that you want to participate more in your endeavor. And if you can link that to their trusted networks, their professors, for example, their mentors, for example, then I think, again, that can lead to improved diversity in the publishing field, in scientific fields, et cetera. A lot of times there's an assumption of trust. Here, come on and do this thing. But the legacy, the histories speak against that. And so one person giving an invitation, and as we look, 400 years of history, which one is going to win out? It has to be a different approach, an approach that says, look, I recognize those 400 years, but I'm going to invest in this relationship in this way. I'm going to build trust. I'm not going to assume trust. And so I think, again, it's a different type of approach. It's an approach that can be informed by listening more to people who've had these experiences. And I think diversifying leadership can also accelerate that as well.
Yep. Great. And so I hope with the questions proposed earlier by Peter and also Jeff that related to as publishers, as folks who work in the scientific publishing world, what are some ways that we can be working to increase diversity? And maybe in our last 2 minutes, I'll highlight a response to Val Sloan's question about resource centers. So her question is there any movement afoot to create something like a diversity and geoscience resource center where discussions, examples of racism, models of change, videos, articles, et cetera. And well, I would say at AGU, there's certainly the beginnings of that. So Billy Williams and the Center for Ethics and Equity and forgetting the exact name of that center, but at that high level of the professional society, there is the organization of resources and materials and real effort to have a sort of one-stop shop where folks can seek some examples and guidance. And it's not complete yet. There are plans to continue to expand the resource center, and they've joined forces with organizations and efforts like the Earth Science Women's Network to do a number of evaluation and assessment looks at places at departments, and then that data is shared on that site. And the committee that Vernon and I are part of, the Diversity Inclusion Advisory Committee, we've been working with staff at AGU to look at options available on dashboards and ways of collecting different kinds of data and metrics that we can share with others. So we really thank you for participating in the webinar, and it was certainly our pleasure to highlight these topics. And do our staff hosts have a final word?
Yes, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Vernon, for leading a really important discussion. Thank all of you, our attendees, for bringing your questions today. And once again, please do take time to respond to the webinar evaluation that you'll receive in your email. Your feedback is helpful to us to make sure that we improve the webinar program. Please also join us for the next SSP webinar, a Scholarly Kitchen webinar entitled The Future of Research Funding, on Tuesday, November 17th. And with that, we are concluded. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.